Okay, welcome. This is first lecture that we are going to do on the American Civil War. I'm going to try to not talk for too long about a lot of this stuff because I want to keep this short and sweet. And what the rip are we going to be talking about today? Well, I want to talk about a number of things leading up to the American Civil War and then the first battle of the American Civil War. So we're going to talk about the cause of the American Civil War, plus the antecedents of the American Civil War, and what the rip are the differences between those. We're going to talk about the election of 1860, and we're going to talk about Fort Sumter, the first battle. So, first thing that I want you guys to understand is that causation does not mean correlation. And what I mean by that is the reason that I'm calling there's a fundamental difference between a cause and the antecedents of something. So an antecedent is just something that happens beforehand. It could be a cause by somebody's mind, okay? But the point is it just happened beforehand. It logically happened beforehand, okay? So we're going to talk about some of these antecedents, which include John Brown, which include Dred Scott, which include the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So things that happened before. But when it comes right back to it, folks, the cause of the American Civil War is slavery. And you probably heard about this in the news recently, people talking about stuff like, well, they're more complex causes to the American Civil War than just slavery. No. Incorrect. There are some other things that people try to schlep as or try to spin as causes of the Civil War, but we'll learn today about why that's kind of a deflection, okay? So yeah, we're going to get into these basic things today. So here we go. What was the fundamental cause of the Civil War? Slavery, period. And any attempt to really make it about something else is an attempt to kind of deflect that blame. And I can understand why people wanted to. You know, when you, at the end of the American Civil War, there was a lot of guilt and there was a lot of blame placed about what had happened. And there was a lot of embarrassment about what had happened on the part of the South. Okay, so you're going to see attempts to spin it many different ways. But that, you know, it's kind of referred to now as the lost cause, meaning no, it was truly about slavery, has always been about slavery, and a lot of these antecedents that we're going to talk about are fully having to do with slavery. Some people try to spin the idea of states' rights. Well, that's a nice thought, but no, because the states' rights that you're truly talking about are the right to own human beings, otherwise known as slavery. And if anybody had a real gripe about states' rights prior to the American Civil War, it was that of Wisconsin, because they said that they were not going to abide by the Fugitive Slave Act because it was their state's right to do so. Even as early as the late 1700s, folks, Thomas Jefferson was already commenting on the differences between Northerners and Southerners. Okay, he said that their personalities were different, and when I say differences, just think of the word sectionalism, okay? Sectionalism had been brewing since the colonial era, even up to the 1860s. Okay, so you remember in U.S. History A when we did the framing dates and you guys understood that, like, hey, this is a roundabout one we're talking about. Well, we're going to be talking about the 1860s here with the American Civil War. And what I'm saying with this is that way back in the colonial era, Thomas Jefferson was already noting how different Northerners and Southerners were, how different they were. 1820 is the Missouri Compromise. And what you need to understand about the Missouri Compromise is that Missouri Compromise line right there, okay, was supposed to be the dividing line of free states to slave states. Okay, so when you look at this map and you see, well, the red states there are the slave states, okay, what they're referring to the Missouri Compromise line is as we expand westward. So this notion of manifest destiny and that the European Americans were going to conquer everything that is now the United States is a conversation that we will have later. But the West represents the nation's future. And as states were to come into the Union, as they were originally territories, and then as we get into these different events like the Mexican-American War, Texas's independence. As these states come into to the Union, if they were north of this Missouri Compromise line, they were going to be free, and if they were south of that, they were going to be slave. So this is a big deal, in not that they were going to see slavery necessarily expand into the West, because those of you that have been to the American Southwest, you understand what it's like out there. You're not going to do a whole lot of farming out there, okay? If you've ever been to West Texas, good governor, it's barren. It's lunar. There's nothing out there, okay? But why were they so worried about this? Because if you're telling me if it's going to happen it's in the nation's West, then you're telling me it's in the nation's future, okay? So I understand that those of you that I had in U.S. History A, I'm kind of rehashing old stuff here, but it is good review just to remember that the Southern antebellum economy is based largely on this slavery thing, okay? Southern agriculture, once this short cotton fiber comes into play, it hits the South like a bomb, and all of these states, particularly those in the Mississippi River Valley, are going to be making a heck of a lot of money on the with this short fiber cotton. It was crazy. Okay, look at 1820 versus 1860. Okay, there is a very good reason why Jefferson Davis is president of the Confederacy, and that's because he made a ridiculous amount of money in Mississippi. What had happened was, I mean, Jefferson Davis grew up no more than 80 miles away in Kentucky from where Abraham Lincoln was born, and his brother sent him a letter and said, Jefferson, you got to get down here to Mississippi. And he did that. And when he came down to Mississippi, he got a couple slaves and got a huge plantation. And in a couple of years, he was this overnight success. He made millions of dollars, okay, selling short fiber cotton, okay? And he became like this businessman that everybody wanted to idolize. Take a look at the cotton exports. There is no product in U.S. history that has ever doubled every 20 years. This is crazy. Okay? So from there on out, they're going to refer to this, this euphemism, so to speak, of slavery as the peculiar institution. Oh, what a peculiar institution. And this was the euphemism, okay, a nice way of putting slavery, because even though they fundamentally knew it was wrong, they knew it was profitable. It was remarkably profitable, okay? So why did Northerners care about the expansion of slavery? Well, because as we mentioned before, okay, representation in government, and if you're telling me it's going to happen in the West, it's going to happen in the nation's future, okay? Problems of the sectional balance in 1850 are as such, okay? California became a state quite literally overnight. 1848, you're going to see that gold rush in California. And the problem with that is that California went right through the middle of that Missouri Compromise line. Okay, so I guess that means that the Missouri Compromise line isn't going to necessarily work. Okay, Southerners are already threatening secession. Okay, the Underground Railroad and the fugitive slave issues. Okay, you remember that. Hopefully, you remember the Fugitive Slave Act from, the Underground Railroad issues going on back when we were talking about this in U.S. History A. Okay, but Southerners are upset because slaves were making it into the North via the Underground Railroad, and they wanted them returned to a state of slavery. And then Northern states were saying that they didn't want to abide by that. Okay. Why did people? I already talked about this. I should have just waited until this slide here. But why do people care about slavery in the Western states? Well, it's the assumption that regarding the institution of slavery is either expanding or dying. It's one of the two. It's not just going to stay the same. A lot of people just looked at the West and went, well, just simple geography will tell you that as the nation expands, we're not going to move slavery out to the West. Okay, but there are a number of times or issues in which the expansion of slavery had a lot to do with whether or not people thought it was going to live or die. And the Dred Scott case is one of those cases because, a slave owner moves to the North and he takes a slave with him. Well, I guess that means that slavery exists in the North then. That's why the Dred Scott case was such a big deal, okay? It stood as a measure of its moral standing everywhere. And after that Dred Scott decision, people looked at it as, well, I guess slavery is everywhere, because if you're telling me a person can go with their slave anywhere they want, and that's their property, then slavery exists everywhere, okay? So, oops. 4 plans previous to 1850 about what to do with this, because this is a huge issue in Congress. How are we going to deal with slavery? How are we going to deal with the expansion in new states? How are we going to deal with representation in Congress? Okay, Wilmot Proviso was a idea by Democrat David Wilmot, a well-known racist. In any new territory we gain from the Mexican-American War, slavery shall never exist. He wanted to preserve free labor in the new territories because he thought free labor was good for whites. So didn't necessarily like slavery because he thought it was a bad idea for whites. Okay, he thought it hurt white people. Okay, another plan was state sovereignty. Your state's right. Allow states to have their right to hold property, and then Congress will decide. Okay, so there's 2 theories. Here's the next one. Okay, popular sovereignty. You're going to hear a lot about popular sovereignty. Okay, it's basically a compromise of the first 2 plans. What you do is take Congress out of it, but as a state becomes a state, let them vote on whether or not you're going to have slavery in that territory. This popular sovereignty idea, Northerners and Southerners alike were kind of like, whoa. Because you're telling me, back in 1820, it's already been established that the Missouri Compromise line is the defining line about where slavery is going to exist. Well, now all of a sudden, if a state in the soon-to-be Northwest, like Oregon, Washington, one of those states becomes a state, and they just open up a referendum and have a vote about whether or not they're going to have slavery. Well, what if they decide they're going to have slavery north of that line? Okay, that's where the real rub comes. Okay, meaning that's why they didn't like it. Okay, and then lastly, the Missouri Compromise line, which you guys already understand, that wasn't going to work because California becoming a state had already dead-lettered that. Okay. Next comes the Compromise of 1850. This was Henry Clay's idea, okay, and there were 5 parts to it, okay? 5 parts to it. Number 1, California's a free state, period. And that's the way it was always going to end up being because of how multicultural California was. Okay, there were so many different types of people living in San Francisco and in different parts of California from that gold rush. There were people from all over the world there, okay? 2, no more slave trade in Washington, D.C. There was a huge slave jail in Washington, D.C. That's where people had, and close there too, there was a huge place where they had these slave auctions, okay? And the idea that slavery existed in Washington, D.C., they wanted to get rid of that, okay? Part 3, Fugitive Slave Act passed, okay? Northerners hated this. Okay, that they would have to abide by a Fugitive Slave Act. 4th part, Texas and New Mexico border dispute was settled about where that line was going to be. And then the New Mexico and Utah are divided. Okay, this gave the possibility of 2 new slave states and will be determined by popular sovereignty. Whoa. Okay, this did not go over very well, but this is what the Compromise of 1850 ended up looking like. Okay. So those states in green are essentially the free ones, and the ones in red are going to be opened up to the principle of popular sovereignty. Well, with the way this map ended up going out here, Southerners didn't care for this because popular sovereignty could have gone the other way too. Any of these states in the Utah or New Mexico territory could have voted to be free as well. Okay, just because it was opened up to the principle of slavery didn't mean it was going to get voted that way. Okay. Another thing that happened before the American Civil War was Harriet Beecher Stowe's very popular book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I'm sure you've heard of. You see Abraham Lincoln's quote about it here. This was 1852, and it was an unbelievably popular book. Okay. 2 million sold in a decade. Okay. Next, political groups that are rising are the know-nothings, otherwise known as the American Party, or more indirectly known as the Nativist Party. Okay, the secret order of the Star-Spangled Banner created in Washington, D.C. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, they do a pretty good job talking about this. Okay, they were anti-Catholic, they were anti-immigrant. Okay, they had the ironic title nativist, calling themselves native to an area in which they had only been living for a generation or two. But they're going to come into politics here in a little bit in a very big way. Okay. Next, I want to talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay. So how is this different than what we had before? Well, all of this now red territory in the Nebraska territory and the Kansas territory is going to be opened up to the idea of popular sovereignty, as well as this area here from the the Compromise of 1850. Whoa. So now we've got a huge area north of that Missouri Compromise line that's opened up to popular sovereignty. Did not go over very well. Well, when they open up Kansas to this referendum, a bunch of border ruffians come over the border from Missouri to vote. Okay? There were only 2,000 eligible voters in that area, and well over 6,000 cast a vote, and go figure, we now have slavery, okay, in Nebraska. Okay, so the response to Kansas-Nebraska, and I apologize for those of you that I had in U.S. History A, but this is a fascinating story. Charles Sumner makes a speech in front of the Senate titled "The Crime Against Kansas," and in that speech, he basically attacked, figuratively, a guy by the name of Preston Brooks. Okay, or excuse me, the uncle of Preston Brooks, a guy by the name of Senator Butler. He called him a Don Quixote, and what that meant was he was referring to him having inappropriate relations with his slaves. Okay, and this was an attack on his honor. Now, we don't really use that word a whole lot anymore, honor. Man, that guy acted with honor there. But trust me, honor is alive and well in the 1850s. Okay, somebody's honor was more important than anything to them. Okay, and when that happened, Congressman Preston Brooks, to defend his uncle's honor, went and beat Charles Sumner with a cane on the Senate floor. He beat him within an inch of his life. I mean, there was blood coming out of his head. Okay, and people had to finally go up and pull the cane away from him. Okay, well, Brooks immediately goes back to resign to South Carolina and says, "I'll let the people of South Carolina decide my fate." And he gets reelected overwhelmingly. If you visit South Carolina today, you can still see the hundreds of canes that people sent to him to commemorate him beating him up. Okay? Well, immediately after that, you have the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre by a guy by the name of John Brown that we'll talk about here in just a little bit. From here, you're going to see the birth of the Republican Party. There are about 6 different parts of the United States that claim to be the birthplace of the Republican Party. But all of these different groups of people, some Northern Whigs, Northern Democrats, Free Soilers, Know-Nothings, all of these people kind of combine to make this new upstart party. Okay? It was just a bunch of people that hated the Kansas-Nebraska Act is what it ended up being. And they almost win, okay, the election of 1856. Now, as you probably know, James Buchanan wins that election of 1856. But John C. Fremont, I mean, imagine an upstart party that if I was just going to create a party today, okay, any third party that's not Democrat or Republican, and then to have that almost win the election 4 years later, it was unbelievable, okay? So yeah, here's your election results, okay? And next, we got John Brown, okay? Now, John Brown is a fascinating story. John Brown was a guy that went into the South to try to start a slave insurrection. He had an idea that he would go around to different plantations and killed the white slave owners. And as he went around, he thought that he would build this army of freed slaves to basically free the South of this scourge of slavery. And American history over time has either sold him as one of two ways, either a hero or a terrorist. It's a fascinating story. Okay? And we might have time to talk about it here later, but I want to get through everything first. Okay, but John Brown, another incident that scared the bejesus out of Southerners, okay, and he's still celebrated in upstate New York today. Okay, the Lincoln-Douglas debates came to the forefront in 1858 and really put Abraham Lincoln on the map, even though he lost this Senate race, where he said a house divided against itself cannot stand. This is where Stephen Douglas and his Freeport Doctrine basically trying to sell the idea of that popular sovereignty, of opening up these states to the possibility of freedom or slave. Okay. Well, your 1860 results end up being in favor of Abraham Lincoln, but there's a number of reasons why this is something to remember. Okay, the Democrats were split, both Northerners and Southerners, and voter turnout was remarkably high. Like 75 to 80% of the public showed up to vote. And as you well know, probably from this year, anything over 50% for an election is pretty freaking good. Okay, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states, and 60% of the people that did vote did not vote for Abraham Lincoln, even though he ended up winning. Okay. Lincoln made it clear that the Republican Party was against the expansion of slavery. And as you remember from U.S. History A, although he is a Republican, he's a moderate Republican. And a lot of people attribute that to the reason why he won this election. Had they put a radical Republican in there, okay, like Charles Sumner or some of these, any of these other abolitionists, wouldn't have happened. Okay. Then on December 18th of 1860, there's the Crittenden Compromise. This was like one of the last-ditch efforts to try to keep the South from leaving. Okay, and secession happens on December 20th of 1860. As soon as you see Lincoln elected, it's first with South Carolina. South Carolina's out, then you're going to see some of these other states leave. Okay. The purple states are going to secede after Fort Sumter, after that first battle of the Civil War. And then these orange-colored states, you should understand that those are the border states. The border states are the states that fought for the North that still had slavery. Okay, fought for the North, but still had slavery. And then you can see the story there of West Virginia, how that became a state as well. Okay, so here is your election results. Okay, and the Republican Party platform, which we don't necessarily have to get into a whole lot. Tough to equate the Republican Party back then with what it was today, but you should understand that the Republican Party was started kind of as this anti-slavery party that was very into industry, very into railroads. So it was a very northern heavy party, okay? And that's that Crittenden Compromise, which is that last-ditch appeal to try to get the South to stay. And then lastly, the Battle of Fort Sumter. Now, Fort Sumter is about the size of 2 football fields. And what had happened is this federal fort, which is in the South, okay, they tried to get those northern troops to leave. They didn't. Well, the Confederacy just started lobbing shells into that area. And in the actual battle, nobody died. There wasn't any death that happened from the shelling of Fort Sumter. But as they surrender the fort and as they leave, a Union soldier walked a little too close to a powder keg, it exploded, and that was your first death of the American Civil War. Okay? And this is where we're going to pick up in our next lecture, and where we are here. Okay? So, yeah, that is all, my dudes.